And it's actually what we call around here, it's the Inishmurray principle, because in Inishmurray they lived on an island, so if they couldn't get something, they made it for themselves.
It's a lot of carving and drilling and grinding.
So all of these individual holes, you actually created each one of them?
Yeah.
Right.
They're totally and absolutely
Is that part of
exasperating.
the attraction for you
Yes.
to some extent?
Yeah, they're maddening.
So he came along, saw his fairly crude
Yes.
harbour, so to speak,
Yes.
but a natural one,
Yes.
and decided this needs something else.
Correct.
And stand up. Straight up. Okay, that's enough for today, I think. Okay, well, maybe try something else tomorrow. When I first cast eyes on this place many years ago, I felt somehow that it was already familiar to me, even though I was sure I had never set foot in it before. But I knew the reason why. The poet William Butler Yeats is buried just a few miles to the south of here in Drumcliff's churchyard beneath Ben Bulben's head, and he would have known this landscape well. I wasn't much more than a child myself when I first read his poem The Stolen Child, wherein the fairies try to entice him away to an enchanted land. Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild. The poem made a great impact on me at the time, and that is why this place was already familiar to me, because this is what I imagined the waters and the wild would always look like. Welcome to the enchanted land of Mullaghmore in the parish of Hamlish in the north of County Sligo. Mullaghmore is a lofty peninsula which could have been an island, some say, before the tides of Donegal Bay heaped up sufficient sand to create a permanent causeway to the foothills of the Dartry Mountains. Of course, it isn't the land that becomes enchanted, it's we humans. And one man's fairyland can be another's struggle for existence against the indifferent forces of nature. It's only when you've put food upon the table that you can then afford to feast your eyes and feed your soul on that particular alignment of stone and water and mountain and night that is uniquely Sligo North. The gods of fishing and farming must first be appeased, and thousands of years before Yeats began to animate the ferny streams below Ben Bulben, our Neolithic forebears had built at Creevy Keel, within sight of the sea at Mullaghmore, a portal into the spirit world, their dead straddling the gap between this life and the next, and helping to reap a rich harvest from both. What did the O'Connor Sligo clan make of it, I wonder, as they held precarious sway in the lands around, for centuries vying with the O'Donnells of Tyrconnell for overlordship of the strategic gateway that was Northern Connacht. All of that changed utterly, of course, after the Cromwellian settlement of the 17th century, which dispossessed the remaining Gaelic clans and bestowed vast acreages of Sligo on English landlords. The lands around Mullaghmore fell to one Sir John Temple and his descendants, who remained absentee until the year 1808, when Henry John Temple, better known as Lord Palmerston, twice Prime Minister of England, first set foot in Mullaghmore and decided to tame its wilder elements and send it on the road to progress. Palmerston's enduring legacy includes the elegant seaside village of Mullaghmore, the disproportionate magnificence of its harbour walls, and the fairy tale castle of Classy Bon, which, set against the backdrop of Ben Bulben, provides us with one of the most instantly recognisable icons in the country. Joe McGowan grew up in the shadow of such icons, and having spent part of his career abroad, returned to write an extraordinarily detailed history of the area, a mix of scholarly research and personal memoir. And one of Joe's personal traits is a determined grip on the traditions of his upbringing, when livelihoods were hard-won and fairies were commonplace.
These are known as elf stones, and most houses had stones like this. They wouldn't always look like this, but they were different to anything else you would find in the fields. When a farmer was out digging and he came across something like this, well, he would pick it up as quite unusual. And the legend is, or the folklore is, that the fairies used these special stones to play at night. They would throw the stones from one to the other. That's how they gambled and frolicked through the fields at night. And when a cow got struck by the fairies with a stone, it went down. And
Just collapsed?
It just went down and collapsed. And it was a big problem to get a cow like that, to rise it up again. You had to get bags and ropes and try to lift it, but oftentimes it was impossible to do that. So the cure for elf shot was to get the elf stones, these special stones that were in various houses, and we had them in my house when I was growing up. And you then had to get the elf stones, go to a three-marin drain. And when I say a three-marin drain, it's generally speaking, it's the junction of three town lands, a drain that runs where three town lands join.
Right.
That water from there would be stronger, would have greater efficacy than just a single drain. That seems to be the thinking behind it. Now in Mullaghmore we didn't have three town lands, but we had three farmlands that joined together away down there near the shore. So you took the water from the three-marin drain, you got the elf stones and dipped the elf stones into the water along with a piece of silver and perhaps a miraculous medals. No harm in having all sides with you.
Yeah.
So you took this water and you fed it to the cow.
And usually that was efficacious. Usually that worked. That had an effect.
Usually that worked. The cow was cured and the cow would get up.
Whenever you were growing up here, Joe, would that kind of story, that kind of practice be commonplace?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Really?
And mine will be the last generation who are cognizant of these old cures.
Right.
But then where the fairies are involved, anything is possible.
Everything's possible with the fairies. I'm gathering that as I'm here, I must say. I mean, looking around here now, this is just what you saw when you got
This
up
is
in
what
the
I
morning.
saw, and I thought every place looked like this.
Yeah.
I had no idea that it was anything special.
You're right.
And we grew up in the shadow of Classiebawn, so I didn't ever think that Classiebawn was anything remarkable.
Right.
The thing that was remarkable and that was often talked about was the Fairy Rock. Now that was of more importance to the local people than Classiebawn itself, and of course Classiebawn is built almost on top of the Fairy Rock.
Right, right.
And there are many customs and stories associated with that.
So these are the very same fairies that probably were throwing these,
Absolutely.
throwing these stones around at your house.
Absolutely, they were very mischievous. Yeats, of course, was very fond of the fairy folklore. Himself and Lady Gregory, we owe them a great debt. And Yeats wrote about the door in the face of Ben Bulben where the fairy host, it opens and the fairy hosts come riding out. And I like to think that the fairy hosts from Ben Bulben came down to visit their friends of the Mullaghmore here, where the Mullaghmore fairies were, and that they revelled about the fields at night. And maybe the fairies from Ben Bulben helped the Mullaghmore fairies to play around the fields. We're so fortunate to have Yeats here and his association and his interest in the Sligo countryside, because of his interest in the area. Even when he didn't live here anymore, we have a rich fairy folklore. And one of the things I admire about him is that he could walk with the gods, Auden and Pound. He could hold counsel with people like that, and yet he could come out to the countryside here and be quite at home with the people of the countryside and be inspired by them and learn something from them and go away then and make something very special out of it.
We can see something else that's equally special on the horizon just a few miles to the west across the glimmering sea. It's an island called Inishmurray, and once it was inhabited by saints and scholars. Today there's still not a sinner in the place, but the silence is filled with the treasures of antiquity, some perhaps over 2,000 years old, and bluebells, Joe tells me, that grew only last week. He's promised to take me there later. And to get to Inishmurray, we'll be setting off from Mullaghmore harbour, mention of which is sure to invoke memories of that day in August 1979 when Lord Mountbatten, a previous owner of Classiebawn, set sail from here with his companions, unaware of the fate that awaited. I'm sure local people feel that enough has been said and written already this year about the events of that day, but it would be to cast a particularly cold eye not to acknowledge that association before moving on. The people of Mullaghmore have certainly moved on, having no other choice but to play the hand that's been dealt, and it's still a hand that's rich in possibilities. Bundoff Beach is endless sand, and the waters of Donegal Bay gleam invitingly beyond the walls of a harbour that Palmerston originally envisaged as much more than a mooring for a few fishing boats and the pleasure craft of the leisured classes of the 19th century. His ambition was to establish here a commercial trading port that could hold its own with any on the western seaboard, to which end he employed the services of the finest civil engineers of the day. Whenever I think of the harbour here at Mullaghmore, I also think of images of pirates and peg legs and pieces of eight. And that's because the man who designed and built this part of the harbour was a Scottish civil engineer named Robert Stevenson. He was, in fact, the grandfather of that great storyteller, the man who wrote Treasure Island, Robert Louis Stevenson. However, Robert Stevenson did not design this gap in the harbour wall, known as the Eye, or sometimes referred to by the structure that straddles the gap, the Girder Bridge. It looks like somebody simply removed a big slice of the harbour wall to create a little back door to admit very small craft perhaps. Well, somebody did cut the opening deliberately, but it had nothing to do with boats going in and out. It was in fact an afterthought of Lord Palmerston's, and he created the eye in the hope that the tide flowing in and out would help to alleviate that perennial problem that was the bane of his plans for Mullaghmore: sand. Yes, the tides and the sand that created your causeway to the mainland could also destroy your harbour. Palmerston's battles with the elements, both natural and human, when we come back. The story of Mullaghmore Harbour is an intriguing one. I remarked earlier on what appeared to be the disproportionate size of the harbour. Not that anyone here is complaining. It is, after all, the beating heart of the area's leisure and tourism industry, while still providing safe anchorage for those hardy few who still ply that most traditional of all trades, fishing. But the size of the harbour is really a reflection of the scale of Lord Palmerston's ambitions in the early 1800s. Ambitions which led to his collaboration with two of the foremost engineers of the day, Alexander Nemo and Robert Stevenson. I've already attributed this section of the harbour to Robert Stevenson, but that may not have been common knowledge until this man began to dig into the archives. John McKeown has written a history of Mullaghmore Harbour, and prior to his efforts, local tradition had it that the entire construction was down to Alexander Nemo, who in fact is only responsible for the first phase, which, however eye-catching, proved to be inadequate. Nonetheless, it was a massive improvement on what was here before Palmerston decided to become a hands-on landlord.
One of the things that triggered it was the destruction of about 12 boats in a winter storm. They used to haul the boats up, put them on a flat rock that was called the Classibon, and the boats were destroyed.
So they were just dragged up, literally.
Correct.
No protection really from
Correct.
From the storms.
Correct.
At all. So that was a very hazardous. I mean, you can assume that for generations earlier than that, the same thing had happened.
Correct.
So there was no protection whatsoever.
No.
So they're very fond of the word classy around here. I noticed
They
that.
are,
I mean, more
yeah.
so than anywhere else on the coast
Yes.
that I've come
Yes.
across. And a classy, just to be clear, is a kind of any kind of an inlet in the coast that allows you to take a boat, and would that?
That's correct.
That
That's correct.
it?
And I think typically, I wouldn't be sure of this, but I think it's typically where the sea cuts out in limestone rock. It does it particularly in limestone rock.
Because
I
it
think
wears away the
It wears
rock.
it out, yeah.
Right,
Yes,
right,
yes.
I see. So he came along, saw his fairly crude
Yes.
harbour, so to speak,
Yes.
but a natural one,
Yes.
and decided this needs something else.
Correct.
So that's the origin of this first bit.
That's right.
Which is right behind us here.
That's
now.
right. And there was another trigger mechanism for that then. Alexander Nemo, he was a Scotchman who was here in Ireland. He worked with the Bogs Commission initially and then moved over to a fisheries board.
Right.
And he drew up plans for piers on the west coast. And one of the places fishing piers, one of the places he mentioned as a possibility was Mullaghmore. And straight away, Palmerston's agents told him about Nemo's plans. They were, Nemo and himself got in touch. Nemo came up with the plans about 1821.
Right.
And he designed what's called here the Old Quay. It's this first quay here.
Right.
And it was designed for fishing purposes,
Right.
and it had the support of the fishing board, okay, and it had the quay, and it also had a breakwater. The Nemo breakwater is now gone.
But the breakwater, what it was here, failed to protect Nemo's harbour wall from the ravages of the winter seas of Donegal Bay, and within 15 years it began to disintegrate, whereupon another Scotsman came to the rescue. Robert Stevenson, the civil engineer who had built the famous Bell Rock Lighthouse on the Inchcape Rock off the east coast of Scotland, not only repaired the Nemo Quay, but also constructed the much more robust and extensive harbour wall that's still more than fit for purpose today.
The Nemo harbour was a fishing harbour, but always Palmerston had a trading as well as a fishing harbour in mind. And he and the fishing board disagreed about that.
Oh, really?
The fishing board wanted a fishing harbour. It had no interest in a trading harbour.
Did they know something that Palmerston didn't know? In other words, did they have a better sense of reality, perhaps, that this was never going to take off as a commercial trading port?
And I think that history would say that they were correct.
But Palmerston, the Foreign Secretary who was accustomed to applying gunboat diplomacy in colonial outposts across the British Empire, wasn't a man to brook opposition from local bureaucrats when it came to his own backyard, so to speak. A character trait that came in useful when he was dealing with that other problem I mentioned earlier. A problem that even the great Robert Stevenson hadn't taken into account.
One of the problems that developed after Stevenson finished was that this inner harbour was all silting up, and boats couldn't come in.
The sand had nowhere to go.
Somewhere to go. Right. And then there was a question of solving that, and Palmerston came up with the idea of opening an eye there. Right. But the Board of Works opposed him very strongly, opposed him for a number of years, but in the end he just went ahead and did it.
Did the Board of Works have a reasonable objection to that?
I don't know. I think on this one...
Would it weaken it or something like that?
I don't know. I think on that one they were wrong. I think it needed it needed some way of scouring out the harbour.
Right. So John McKeown and his colleagues in the Mullaghmore and Cliffany Historical Society have done some service to the local community in unearthing all this information about the harbour. But they've also done some service to the reputation of Robert Stevenson, who'd been kind of sidelined by history, until John and his colleagues were directed to the National Library of Scotland in search of the original blueprint of the harbour.
So we went searching for it, and lo and behold, in the National Library in Scotland, we got all the old Stevenson's drawing.
You travelled pretty far to get your information.
That's right, and they were very excited that we asked the question, because nobody had asked about these drawings in all those years.
So they had been lodged in the library.
That's right.
After the project.
That's right.
And that nobody had ever opened them.
Nobody had ever opened them afterwards, and they had to have professional archivists to open them and take photographs of them, because they would have disintegrated in the hands of
Get away.
Yes.
Right. So you must have been excited as well.
We were
a wee bit like doing a bit of archaeology.
We were thrilled, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you got all that information yourself, and they were happy for you to show all of these plans.
That's right. Obviously, they wanted their names to be recognised, and we were happy to do that.
It's a good selling point. I think you should have a big notice board up saying the man who built this harbour was Robert Louis Stevenson's grandfather. Right. and we're claiming him. My seafaring friends tell me that the way to avoid seasickness is to keep your eyes fixed on the horizon. I find that advice works fine as long as you're standing on dry land. Out here, the horizon is a frantic thing. By the end of our 50-minute trip out to Inishmurray, I had stopped talking to Joe McGowan and had begun to nurture a deep resentment of the dolphins that kept popping up out of the sea to mock our pedestrian progress. We had to disembark by clambering onto some class of a classy, with our ferryman warning that our time on the island would be limited if we wanted to catch the tide for the return journey. By this stage, I was planning to spend the rest of my life in Inishmurray. At first, it was just because I was on terra firma again, but almost immediately, the place begins to cast its spell. Since the 1940s, Inishmurray has been abandoned to the elements, and the elements have been extraordinarily kind to it. Alongside the modern ruins of the island's most recent inhabitants is an early monastic settlement that the great peripatetic scholar John O'Donovan once described as perhaps the most perfect cyclopean ruins in the world. He was referring to the primitive skill of building with stone boulders that provided St. Malash and his followers who lived here from the 6th century onwards with a kind of soul-satisfying setting that was the perfect complement to the contemplative life. I know that John O'Donovan would have been overjoyed to have had someone like Joe McGowan as his guide, because if your time is almost sacrilegiously short, there's no better man to deliver a series of snapshot insights. Joe, I suppose the first thing you notice when you come in here is just simply the bluebells. It's just
That's true.
The colour is amazing, especially against the grey, greeny lichen colour of the walls.
That's true. And you just do not expect it on an island. Bluebells are usually associated with woodland.
That's true.
And when you come in here, and even in the fields, and particularly in this area here, the contrast is quite more remarkable.
Well, the walls of the cashel. Now, it is a cashel.
It is known as the cashel.
And you were saying you think this goes right back even before the monastic settlement here.
The weight of evidence is that it is at least Iron Age and possibly Bronze Age. And the monks, when they came here, they realised this was a good place, it was a sheltered place, and decided to colonise it.
I suspect one of the reasons why it is so intact and left relatively unmolested, in spite of the fact that the islanders who lived here for hundreds of years also built stone houses.
They did indeed.
In other places you would think they would be taking the stones from here to do those houses, but they had obviously had a lot of reverence for this place.
And that's the word that I would choose. They had a reverence for the place. They respected this highly. Everything that was in here, it was protected by the islanders, and it was not scavenged for stone at all. It was highly revered, and of course it was a burial place for the monks as well, and for the men of the island at a later time.
That remark about men only being buried within the walls of the cashel refers to an ancient practice in Inishmurray that seems to have persisted into modern times, whereby women who died here were buried in Mullaghmore, the women's graveyard, which is located beside Champelnaman down by the shore. Joe explains by telling a story.
I had the great privilege of talking to many of the islanders, and one of the islanders that I spoke to was Florrie Brady. And Florrie was a wonderful Shanachie, a wonderful speaker. She brought the whole island life alive for me. And she spoke about an incident where people decided at a point in time in her lifetime where, they said, well, they would dismiss this. Well, why couldn't a wife be buried alongside of her husband?
They thought it was an outmoded custom
yes,
in her lifetime. Even.
In her lifetime,
right.
Yes. So they discussed it, and a discussion took place on the island, and they decided to bury the woman beside her husband inside in the cashel area where her husband was buried. And she explained it so wonderfully with great movements of the arms and all that sort of thing. They went up in the morning, and there it was right before them, the coffin. They buried the woman the day before, and the coffin was right over the ground. It was the sensation. They called all the islanders over, and everybody was astonished that the earth wouldn't receive the coffin of the woman. So they had to take the woman and bury her down here in Mullaghmore.
The implication being that somebody had dug the coffin up during the night, or did they believe that mysterious forces were at work here?
Well, it all depends. What I prefer to believe in mysterious forces. I just love the mysterious forces.
Right.
And
is that a suspension of disbelief on your part, perhaps?
Well, it may be, but I won't admit to it.
Right. Okay. Right. But in any case, so I mean, in other words, the ground refused to accept the coffin of the woman.
That's true.
And they reburied it here.
That's true. So it's not so difficult to understand when you realise that was a monastic site, where it was men only.
But here was a separate plot set aside for the burial of women. Women would have been living on the island, during the period of the monastic settlement, or would there have been very few women at that stage?
There have been very few women, and population may have changed over that period as well. We're really talking about 6 centuries.
Yeah, but the custom just continued, in other words, over the centuries of burying women.
It did indeed.
Right.
And there's a very interesting story told about St. Columkill, who had a finger here. St. Malash, after all, was St. Columkill's confessor, and St. Columkill paid many visits to the island. And at a point in time, Malash petitioned Columkill to get a cow on the island, because they had no cow, and of course milk would be a great source of sustenance for them. So he petitioned Columkill, and Columkill thought about it for a while, and his answer was, an áitina bí an bó bí an ban, agus an áitina bí an ban bí an murchún.
Right, so
which translated means, every place there's a cow, there's a woman, and every place there's a woman, there's mischief. So given the modern history of the church, maybe it was a very, very wise decision.
Right, okay.
But
right.
It needs to be explained in the sense that, in case there are any feminists or ladies listening to this.
As there will be.
As there will be,
yeah.
Indeed. I came to the realisation through my researches over the years that it was women that looked after the dairy. I always qualify this to get myself back in good favour with women,
right.
That women were in charge of the dairy because men's hygiene wouldn't be sufficient. So this is why the women milked the cows and the women looked after the dairy,
right.
While the men went out and dug the fields and did man things.
I think you've rescued yourself fairly well there, because the men are dirty, that's why they weren't allowed near the milk, in other words. Back briefly to the cashel again, and a story that indicates that while women may not have been admitted after death, there was something here inside the perimeter that only a woman could actually use.
As we said, it's known as the fertility stone.
Right.
Now, the story that's told about it is that if a woman wanted to get pregnant and she wasn't able to do so, come here to this fertility stone and put the fingers in here like this, and there's a place here for the thumbs, and kneel down and just, say a few prayers, or let the magic of the stone or whatever it might impart to you, let it do its work.
Right.
That's all you had to do. And the question arises, of course, Is it a load of superstitious nonsense, or did it really work? But it's very difficult to come up with evidence. But there was a couple that came from Italy, from Carrera in Italy, to the parish of Hamlish, and they had heard about this fertility stone. Its fame had spread that far. So they went to the parish priest, and of course the parish priest would poo-poo anything like that it had have pagan connotations.
Mere superstition.
Mere superstition. But eventually any of them prevailed upon him, and he did direct them to a boatman down at Milk Harbour. The boatman brought them out here, and she went through the performance of what she needed to do. And all we know is that afterwards, that sometime after this, about a year after the lady came here, the altar in Cliffney was completely redecorated in Carrera marble. So we may add 2 and 2 here and hopefully get 4.
So it worked.
It did work indeed. Now
Right.
there is another explanation, that these were in recesses here were for wooden arms.
Right.
So you had your cross then with the wooden arms, and here these 2 holes that we have back here, that they were pins to hold the wooden arms in place.
Right.
So you can pick one.
Right. I mean, it seems odd to put wooden arms onto a stone cross, mind you.
Very odd indeed.
Right, okay. Well, I mean, people can decide for themselves,
They can.
I suppose. But again, you're quite receptive to all of these stories.
I am, absolutely.
Right. Time and tide wait for no man, not even Joe McGowan. And this short visit does scant justice to the wealth of lore that Joe has about Inishmurray. We haven't even touched upon the stations, the cursing stones, the battle with the Danes, the beehive cells, the sweat house, or the altar of fire. If you ever go to Inishmurray in Joe's company, get him to show you a stone that holds the tide back and make a day of it. I, meanwhile, have a date with the flower lady when we come back. I felt we had to leave Inishmurray in rather a hurry because of the tides. But there is a man who can help tie up a few loose ends for me. His name is Martin Byrne, and he lives in the village of Cliffney, which is where you can leave the main Sligo road to go down to the peninsula of Mullaghmore. Martin is a man of many interests and talents. He's a musician, an artist, a gardener, a tour guide, and he's also a care worker looking after his elderly mother-in-law. He's fascinated by Inishmurray. The tune he's playing is an Inishmurray reel, and the walls of his polytunnel are lined with colourful depictions of the carved stones of Inishmurray, which we'll get to presently. First, the house that he lives in was once the old RIC barracks, but long before that, it was something else.
I only learned recently Lord Palmerston built our house in 1842, and I understand he built it as quarters for his servants, because whenever he came to stay in Cliffney, Classy Bawn did not exist at the time.
Right.
So he stayed in the pub across the road. It's a pub now, but at the time it was a hotel, and at one stage it was called Palmerston's Arms.
He was the first of his family, the Temples.
Yes.
They were all absentee landlords
They
up
were.
until his time, isn't
That's right.
Isn't that right?
He inherited this country. It used to be known as Palmerston's country at one stage, like Yates' country is down below,
Yeah.
and that is gone again. But he inherited this in 1802, as far as I remember.
Right.
And it was 6 years, so it was about 1808 when he visited first of all. And at that stage it was all bog, one huge bog towards the mountain, and it was all sand towards the sea. And at some stage there was a sand encroachment as well.
Oh, yes.
The whole coast, I think, from Sligo up as far as Bundoran was inundated with sand. So Palmerston was actually the person who introduced the bent grass, and he actually planted and combated the sand dunes and turned it back into fields again.
So it's fair to say, to attribute to him the kind of achievement of what the landscape that you see around here.
That's right,
Because
yeah.
otherwise it would be just...
Palmerston literally put Cliffney on the map.
Right.
It wasn't on any map. It was a strip of road that ran through kind of no man's land, I think, between Grange and Bundoran. So it was actually a bunch of maybe 6 or 7 townlands here were called halfway house, and so he literally did put Cliffney on the map.
But of course, there's always a human cost to such progress, and despite his many improvements, there are still those locally who would be slow to forgive the zeal with which Palmerston, in common with other landlords hereabouts, used the assisted passage scheme in the years after the famine to rid his overpopulated estate of some 2,000 impoverished tenants by shipping them off to Canada to become somebody else's concern. But even the harshest adjudicators of his stewardship would acknowledge his undoubted achievements. And it's with regard to his putting Cliffney on the map that Martin Byrne would hope to emulate Palmerston. And this is where the stones of Inishmurray play a part, as you're about to discover.
These are life-size copies of the collection of stones in Inishmurray. Now, as far as I understand, there are 99 carved stones in Inishmurray, and 16 of those 99 would be the cursing stones. Now, there's about 7 replicas of the cursing stones left out there, but originally there were 16 of them.
I see.
And the rest of them are cross slabs, pillar stones. There's some small fragments of stones. There's a few unfinished ones out there.
Right.
Some of them were altar slabs. Some of them were parts of the stations around the island.
Right.
And there were 15 stations, I believe, so a lot of them
right.
would have been out on the different
I
altars.
see you're recreating one of the stations
I'm recreating,
outside here
that's
now
right.
as well.
Yeah,
Right,
yeah.
right.
The plan eventually is to actually recreate Inishmurray here in the village. And
Right. I
My
was wondering.
plan, yeah.
Yes. So you have this vision ultimately
I do.
of a kind of build Inishmurray here in Cliffany type
Yeah.
of thing.
It can be difficult to land out there. You need to have a certain level of health and fitness to actually be able to jump on and off the boat out there in stormy weather.
Yeah.
So, you know, for people in wheelchairs, for small children, for like if I look after an 86-year-old, for people like that, it would be nice to have
So
something.
access is not easy.
Access is not easy.
Right.
And also access to the art from Inishmurray is not easy anymore, because to preserve the stones they have been locked away in the schoolhouse.
Of course. So that's your long-term vision, Martin, to
Long-term
create
vision.
something that can actually see what it's like out there, see all of these stones,
Yeah.
without actually having to make the journey.
Exactly.
Right. To which end, Martin is attempting to chisel out replicas, using much the same methods those ancient islanders would have employed. You may recognise the chalked outline of the so-called fertility stone that Joe McGowan showed us earlier. But the stone in which Martin is about to do a rubbing, improvising with grass you'll notice, is not in fact an Inishmurray replica, but one which belongs actually to Cliffany, and it's inscribed with St Bridget's cross. And I do like the colour as well.
It is. It's an interesting. Necessity is the mother of invention. I think that's what covers it, really. You know.
Yeah.
And it's actually what we call around here. It's the Inishmurray principle, because in Inishmurray they lived on an island. So if they couldn't get something, they made it for themselves. you
Sure.
know. So and it's still
Yeah.
there in some of the people who came in from Inishmurray. They would be very practical people. You know.
Well, you had to be self-sufficient to live out there.
Oh,
I
you
would
did.
imagine.
You did. So it's a great way to show school kids, to get school children interested in archaeology.
Oh, you do this with kids as well, do you?
I do, yeah.
That's
our
very
Bridget.
good, isn't it?
Yeah.
You can see the cross very clearly now.
Yeah.
Much more clearly than you can see it on
Oh
the
yeah.
stone.
Yeah.
And you can actually hang that up. That's a very
Well, you can
lovely,
take- you
lovely
can take-
decoration.
You can take that with you.
Can I take that
You
one
can
with
take that
me?
with you.
Right. If Palmerston had not initiated the process of stabilising the sand dunes of Bunduff Beach by planting all those bent grasses, a process that continues today, by the way, then it's doubtful that Trudy Lomax would have this huge expanse of maher on which to wander in her search for a flower that has become a kind of gentle obsession with her. Orchids, apparently, thrive in this sandy, shelly soil, so she counts herself fortunate to live overlooking a landscape that affords her such a happy hunting ground. Trudy, these were kind of hard to spot. For an amateur like me, they're very hard to spot. They could look like little bits of clover from a distance.
Absolutely, but when you get your eye in,
Right.
you'll find that you'll pick them up much quicker.
There's a northern
Marsh.
Northern Marsh. Right,
okay.
Right.
And they are a little bit bewildering, because if you look at this fellow here,
It's another one over here.
it's
yeah.
another one. It's the same. It's
a darker colour.
but it's a darker colour because it's still in bud.
I see.
As it opens, it'll get pinker
And paler.
and paler, and they can vary a lot. The thing that drives me nuts with orchids is I'm always hoping to find something really rare.
Is it possible? You told me earlier on that there were something, I don't know how many thousands of different kinds of orchids in the world. Roughly speaking, how many?
30,000.
30,000. And how many do we have in this
We
country?
have something just over 300 different
Oh, is that all?
actual species.
Right,
Yeah.
Right. So we're quite
But
limited.
in this area, we think we're pretty good, because we have approximately 13, 14, possibly 15
Right.
different species.
Is it possible for you to spot a species that you've never seen before,
yeah.
even now?
Yeah.
Even though you search here
yeah.
every day,
Yeah.
all of your life?
I know what a fly orchid looks like, but I've never actually seen one.
Is it conceivable you could see one
It's
here?
conceivable, yeah.
Right.
I haven't, and I'd love to.
Right.
That would count as a bit of a find.
So the other point we should make, I suppose, even though it's a beautiful day today and it's early June, we're still at the wrong time of the year, really, aren't we?
We need another few weeks of sunshine, preferably,
Right.
and a bit of heat.
And July and August.
July and August, you will have all sorts. You'll have pyramidals, butterflies, frog orchids, tway blades.
So here you have this whole area around is well, it's sandy under it. These lakes you were telling me,
Yeah.
right? And there's a couple, and these are very shallow lakes.
Yeah,
And
they're sandy-bottomed lakes.
right.
And according to the old locals, Mullaghmore was once an island, and this strip across here was all sea.
It was all sea.
Yeah,
So if we
and
went
these
down
are the
underneath-
remains
I
of that.
see. So there'd be bits of shell and all
Yeah.
sorts and things right underneath
Yep.
it. So that makes it very limey indeed.
It does.
It doesn't stop the bog cotton growing.
No,
There's
no.
great profusion of it. That is.
Oh, that's only the beginning.
As we wandered further in search of orchids, Trudy wasn't averse to pointing out some of the other notable flora of the Maher, such as the fly-eating butterwort, the sprawling bird's foot trefoil, the beautifully dressed and well-mannered scarlet pimpernel, a very nervous specimen of the quaking grass, and finally, an orchid after my own heart, the common spotted. Why spotted? Does it have actually
It's
spots on it?
actually the spots, it's very deceptive.
Right.
Because the spots are referring to the leaves.
Ah.
And this, just to make it more difficult, the leaves are not necessarily always spotted.
Right. But you recognise the
It's
flower
just to
from it.
fool you, you know.
It's a kind of how would you describe it? Is it kind of mauve colour
It's
almost? yeah?
that one is a sort of a mauvey colour.
Right.
It could also be verging on white.
Right.
There's huge variations in them, and again they crossbreed, and you've got species, you've got subspecies, you've got varieties of subspecies.
They're untrustworthy kind of
They're
things.
totally and absolutely
Is that part
exasperating.
of the attraction for you to
Yes.
some extent? I
Yeah, they're
suppose, right?
maddening.
They're maddening, right. But I noticed when once you get hooked on orchids, that seems to be it
Oh,
for life more or less.
it is.
So it's like a kind of
They
a,
get
like
a
an illness
hold.
of some sort.
It is definitely a chronic illness.
And one for which Trudy doesn't hope to find a cure. Our orchid hunt over for the day, we retired to Trudy's house in Mullaghmore and her late husband's boat shed, which once again is becoming a hive of activity. Max and Lomax, when we come back. When Rodney Lomax passed away in December 2014, it was of course a sad loss for Trudy Lomax and their family. But it must have also seemed to his many friends that another era had come to an end in Mullaghmore. For as long as anyone could remember, Rodney had been running charter trips out of the harbour on his boat the Celtic Dawn. But he was also a highly respected master boat builder who had been practicing and teaching the trade of building traditional craft here in his workshop overlooking Donegal Bay for many years. For a time, the boat shed lay empty and silent, the fastidiously arranged tools gathering dust, until Max Brosey decided that this would be a suitable setting for his own trade. Max greatly admired Rodney's skill in bending wood to his will, because Max does something similar himself, creating sea-going wooden objects wherein function and beauty are combined. But he also creates things from wood whose function might simply be to intrigue. Max's sculptures have a sea coastal driftwoody kind of theme, but the shapes that he's contrived, and they're all wooden, believe it or not, are anything but random.
This one is actually bleached, the rest of them they're sandblasted, and the reason I sandblast them is to resemble driftwood. To get the three-dimensional structure of the grain. It brings out the early and the late wood, and it just brings out the innards of the wood, the very honest appearance. I don't really do shiny or smooth.
You dry it out of some sort of way. It's
Yeah.
extremely light as well.
Well,
That's the other thing.
You've said dry it out there. If
Yeah.
you see the shape of them, none of them are straight. They're all angled or twisted or something.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
because I turned them when they were sopping wet, straight off the tree,
Right.
and then they're left to season and twist as they're made. Each piece is designed before it's made.
Before you do this on paper, practically speaking.
On paper and in my head. And the grain layout,
Okay.
it's laid out on the lathe in such a way that it'll move the way I want it to.
Right. So you manipulate them quite a lot.
I do.
The sea theme
Yeah.
is very obvious in this, I think. But that's wood.
That's actually, I said oak earlier, that's sycamore.
How did you make that in heaven's name there?
It's a lot of carving and drilling and grinding.
So all of these individual holes, you actually created each one of them?
Yeah.
Right. Barnacle encrusted is what I
Absolutely.
think about.
Absolutely. And that's the whole idea, to kind of evoke a reaction from the viewer.
So all of your pieces are kind of they're abstract rather than representational, and they're not really functional, they're just
Strictly non-functional.
strictly non-functional. Max's sculptures are fascinating works of real artistry and craftsmanship, but I'm here to acquire some of his functional wooden products, no less beautiful but designed to serve a purpose. Max, a lot of people would be surprised to think of a surfboard being made of wood,
Yeah.
but yours, traditionally they were made of wood, where they originated.
They were, and I suppose I latched onto it in 2006, 2007. I wanted to combine my two interests, that being the sea and working with wood.
You used to surf yourself?
I did, and then it got too crowded for me and I stopped. But
Right.
yeah, and I ran a business called Cedar Surfboards, making these guys, and they're hollow. There's a skin all the way around, it's about 1/4 of an inch thick of cedar, and there's an internal rib work that offers its structure and strength.
It's like a wee mini boat, in other words. There's a kind of
It
a
is.
structure inside it to keep it
The
like
ribs,
that.
yeah, and the keel, if you like.
But this is, just to be clear, this is not a veneer, this is actual wood.
That's actual wood. It's 1/4 inch thick cedar wood, and you knock on it, you can hear it.
It's hollow.
It is hollow.
Right.
It's very light. You can see the weight.
Oh yeah. You think you're going to be lifting up a big, almost like the side of a cabinet, but it's actually it is. It's totally light. So it's filled with air, in other words.
It's
really.
filled with air. It weighs marginally more than a regular surfboard, and then finally the whole thing is glassed with 4-ounce fiberglass cloth and epoxy resin, which makes it 100% waterproof and very much more ding resistant than a regular surfboard. But the important thing with them is that it has this little guy here, which is a vent plug.
A vent plug.
A vent plug, which you can unscrew and do up, because when the...
Does water get inside it then, in other words?
No, you do it up to prevent the water getting in, but when you have it in your car or something and it's a hot day, you got to open it or else the board's going to swell up and bust with the air expanding
the
inside.
air expands inside. So does it literally fatten up, in other words?
It does. I've seen it do it on a hot summer's day, and I had to open it and it hissed as the air ran out.
Right. That's not likely to happen to me, because regretfully my surfing days are over. But my paddleboarding days are about to begin. And Max makes a kind of Rolls-Royce version of these paddles. Again, an object of beauty in its own right.
And you can see the flex in this paddle.
Right. You're not going to break it easily?
I'm not. They're quite strong, but it's got quite a lot of flex.
Right.
So if you're going long distance, if you're going exploring the Mullaghmore shoreline, going around the head or something,
Yeah.
this has got flex, so it prevents the tension going into your joints.
Okay. It looks a very complicated thing to make, Max. And which is which now? You're talking about two different kinds of wood.
We've got cedar,
Yeah.
we've got ash, cedar, ash, cedar, ash.
So it alternates,
Cedar.
in other
Yeah.
words, right? Right. And so, sporting a paddle fit for a champion, I head off to Mullaghmore harbour to meet one such. Emmett O'Doherty is an Irish paddle boarding champion and competes for Ireland at an international level. In his spare time, Emmett teaches beginners how to stay upright and stay dry. This is his greatest challenge to date. Sorry, before we go any further, I have to get you to admire my paddle. This is one that Max made, and he very foolishly lent it to me so that I could give it a kind of a christening today.
We'll definitely give it a christening. That's a beautiful
Isn't it
beautiful
lovely?
paddle.
It's
Yeah.
far too nice to be used for something used by me, put it that way. I think Emmett agreed, although he politely said that it was simply too big for me. Anyway, we put Max's paddle aside for another day.
So to start off, we have this is our paddle, which is unique to stand-up paddleboarding.
Okay.
It's a single-sided paddle. It has a front and a back. There's a red sticker on the front of it here.
Right.
So that's not the side that goes into the water. It's the back side.
This is a
the
mistake
part-
I made yesterday when I was practicing with Max. I was doing this, thinking that you had
common mistake. Yeah.
So it has to go that way.
It has to go that way.
The angle is the other way around.
Yes.
In other words.
So we've got the paddle,
Right.
which is a 15-degree angle on it. There's the shaft, which is the part in the middle, and then there's the handle.
Right.
And again, we'd always hold our handle with our thumb underneath and our fingers on top. And again, we don't grip too tightly, just keep it nice and loose.
Next, we practiced what to do when, not if, as Emmett said confidently, I fall into the water.
Put the paddle onto the white part of the board up there. Yeah, put your hand in here like this and bring yourself up onto the board and spin around and face your paddle. Now that's pretty much the only time you're going to let go of your paddle, the whole time.
Right.
Excellent. Now
Right. And stand up. Straight up. Okay, that's enough for today, I think. Okay, well, maybe try something else tomorrow. And without much further ado, we were off. If this be the waters and the wild, then the fairies can count me in. For what I might lack in grace and poise, the glorious seascapes all around me more than compensate the eye. And talking of eyes, we found another use for the one Palmerston bequeathed to Mullaghmore harbour. Inevitably, I fell into the water, and was very glad, I can tell you, that we had practised that manoeuvre on the sand. I'd forgotten that I didn't know how to do it after a while. I was just sort of following you. And it's just the important thing is to keep your chin up and keep looking where you're going.
But you're saying you don't know how to do it, but as in after 2 minutes paddling you knew what you were doing.